Welcome back. So, José Blanco and Alexis Carreño will be in conversation about gender and fashion. José Blanco is originally from Costa Rica and is a professor of fashion at Dominican University, where his research focuses on dress and popular culture, with an emphasis on male fashion. Dr. Alexis Carreño is associate professor in the art department of the Universidad de Chile. He holds a PhD in art history and criticism from Stony Brook University and an MFA from the University of Chile. A Fulbright scholar from 2009 to 2013, Dr. Carreño works at the intersection of art, fashion, and masculinities, and was the curator of a 2018 exhibition on Chilean men's fashion. Please join me in welcoming Jose and Alexis for their conversation.
Okay, so Aji, all right. Well, hello everyone. We're very happy to be part of this symposium. Alexis wrote a chapter for the upcoming book that is tied to this exhibition, and he wrote a chapter on gender. So I'm happy to be able to talk to him. I was looking at some of the main topics that I've heard so far in the symposium, and obviously we noticed ideas of colonization, decolonization, and invisibility, and inclusivity, and exoticization. And as I'm there sitting, I'm thinking, well, all of this, of course, is also related to gender. So I wanted to start a conversation by, oh, yeah. Thank you, Alexis. There you go. All right. Handling papers and the clicker. So I wanted to start a conversation by conceptualizing the perceptions in Latin America of gender as Western Eurocentric binaries that were, for the most part, imposed in the region by colonial powers. And also they were later firmly ingrained in Latin America during the 19th century by intellectual elites as part of the process of nation formation, and they wanted to continue keeping those ties with Europe. In the work I've done with my handsome husband, who's right there, Raul Vasquez, we have explored these binaries in Latin American national costumes, as in the image above, where you see men's dress reflecting a connection to global standardized men's attire associated with modernity, and then women's dress is often exoticized with colors and flounces and embellishments. So in this context, women seem to be charged with the idea of representing the nation as exuberant and colorful, perhaps even exotic. We've also done some work analyzing the fantasy costumes, which used to be called national costumes, at the Miss Universe beauty contest and other contests, where we see, again, this sort of like exoticization, self-exoticization, tropicalization, or self-tropicalization of women's dress. So as we know, in Latin America, we had fashion designers that have used to embrace those binaries, but recently we see more of an interest in questioning those binaries. Here is the work of Carlos Pineda, a Mexican fashion designer, and of course if we look at his designs, they could be easily classified by someone as gender, folklore, womanhood perceptions of womanhood, but I love these other images here, the designer themselves, and in the way they style themselves, and when we put those garments on male-presenting bodies, then we see an interest in, of course, continue questioning those binaries. So in the book that is going to accompany this exhibit, Alexis wrote about how Latinx designers are questioning these binaries, and then you start that with sort of like reviewing some important concepts in terms of gender. So maybe you can walk us through that.
Can you show the So to answer your question, Jose, I will briefly explain what genderless fashion is. Genderless fashion is made up of garments that do not contemplate the specific forms of the body, male or female, or appropriate clothing and apply it to the opposite gender, for example, skirts for men. However, more than legitimizing men in skirts, genderless fashion redefines men and women as essential categories and seeks individual expression over the masculine and feminine to reveal the person. In this image, we are seeing two genderless fashion icons. On the right is British fashion designer Harry Reid, and on the left is American poet, performance artist, and trans activist Alok. So some antecedents of genderless fashion in recent decades are unisex fashion. For example, the interchangeable skirts and pants for both sexes created in the 1960s, as we see in this picture, and cross-dressing that includes drag, which is feminizing a masculine body or feminizing a female body, and genderfuck, which is the next image. So genderfuck is also a form of cross-dressing, and genderfuck practices emanated from the countercultural movements of the 1960s and mock the notion that underlined the gender binarism based on anatomy, as we see in these two pictures from the 1970s. Genderfuck can include the use of, for example, dresses and facial hair in a single outfit to create confusion and ambiguity. So can we see the next picture? Genderless fashion finds its greatest affinity with genderfuck, since both criticize binary identities projected from biology. However, in the commercial context of current fashion, genderless clothing distances itself from the countercultural components or character of genderfuck, but it has made visible identities that previously remained in the margins. So we are seeing in these two pictures two examples of non-binary style in the Euro-American mainstream culture of the present. On the right, we see the actor Billy Porter, and on the left is Harry Styles. Harry Styles and Billy Porter have questioned the binarism of clothing and sexuality through an ambiguous wardrobe, as we see in these two photos.
Thanks, Alexis. And of course, we know that these concepts related to gender are kind of like ever-evolving as we learn more on gender identities and continue breaking away from those limiting binaries. But let's talk a little bit about then how those challenges to gender binaries are being explored in Latin American and Latinx fashion. And yes, we have Barbara Sanchez-Kane.
So the influence of genderless design in Latin America, like other cultural productions, is related to the creations of European and North American designers. Therefore, the question arises as to how these proposals generated in fashion centers are received and transformed in peripheral places from the material and creative resources available in their context. Feminists of color have coined the term intersectionality to explain how gender identities are intersected by social class, ethnicity, body shapes, and others. Power and privilege structures impact the way people experience their gender identities. These consequences and repercussions are analyzed in my paper through the work of, for example, Mexican fashion designer Barbara Sanchez-Kane, who is one of the few Latinas currently working on men's wear from a non-binary perspective. Her designs stage a new man whose strong sentimentality contrasts with the dominant Mexican machismo. She has embroidered garments with phrases such as male tears or macho sentimental, as we can see in the picture on the right. So these phrases allude to the notion that men don't cry. Similarly, she has made deconstructed garments, as we can see in the picture on the left, and masculine corsets that blurred the differences between men's and women's clothing.
All right, well, thank you. I will make some comments on the concept of machismo later, but I wanted to point out first that notions of gender in Latin American and Latinx fashion are usually mediated by the Western media gaze, including elitist publications in Latin America that exist almost only to replicate, Western media. But then in Western media and in those elitist publications, we continue seeing an othering of Latin American gender. So this Westernized gaze kind of like ignores gender identities of in Latin America and the diaspora, and I find that problematic, particularly when we examine Latin American and Latinx fashion, mostly by looking at the work of designers and without exploring other facets of fashion, such as everyday clothing, street styles, small businesses, taste groups, subcultures, and groups that challenge modern binaries, such as Oaxaca's Mushe. They are an example of the many third genders in indigenous communities that were displaced during colonization. Here is the December 2019 cover of Vogue Mexico and Latin America, which featured Muche Estrella Vasqueza. So, just a little bit on looking at gender from other perspectives that are not necessarily fashion design, but we wanted to also get back to the realm of popular culture and fashion design, and of course, we would have to talk about Bad Bunny, and we're very honored to then also talk a little bit about Willy Chavarria, who was here just a moment ago.
Yeah. So clearly the questioning of gender binarism has also had repercussions and manifestations in Latinx and Latin American cultures. So as we see in this picture, the Puerto Rican singer Bad Bunny has challenged the model of traditional Latino masculinity by appearing in his videos wearing pink or painting his nails. This picture is for the January 2022 issue of American Vogue, and Bad Bunny was photographed wearing an Alexander McQueen female bag and an oversized jacket and pants by Latinx genderless fashion designer Willy Chavarria. Willy Chavarria has reimagined the macho Latino archetype by showing men as emotional and vulnerable. His collections are gender fluid, but shy away from androgyny. Oversized silhouettes characterize collections that suggest aggression and sensitivity at the same time. Chavarria has brought Chicano style to luxury fashion runways and reinterpreted clothing of the working class and cholos in a clean, sleek style, as we can appreciate in these three images. And in his collections, Chavarria celebrates Latino men who are feared and judged solely for their appearance.
Yeah, and I wanted to mention that certainly the point of Latinx individuals being feared and judged for their appearance is an important one to highlight. Still today, systemic oppression based on gender, class, and race in Latin America and racism against the Latin American diaspora around the world prevents many of us from fully expressing ourselves through fashion and dress. Michelle McVicker, who's in the audience, wrote about how Chavarria's work has centered the Pachuco and the Cholo, but how those references come from men and women who saw themselves as outsiders in the United States and decided to visually signify difference via dress. Just a week ago, I was having this conversation with one of my Latinx students. And by the way, I teach at a Hispanic serving institution in Chicago where nearly 70% of my students are Latinx. So we were talking about how the concept of these oversized clothes when worn on Latinx bodies are perceived different than when they are worn on white bodies. And my Latinx students were talking about how they used to, get certain looks when they were wearing these styles, but now those looks, as more white people are embracing sort of like the baggy, oversized looks, those looks are now more of praise or curiosity, perhaps. On an essay for, I need to move here. On an essay for an upcoming second issue that I'm editing with my husband on Latin American and Latinx fashion for the journal Fashion, Style, and Popular Culture, Jessica Garcia Hernandez writes about Paisa style, which for her signifies cultural pride in a moment of heavy anti-immigrant sentiment. She does that by analyzing the work of 4 artists: queer photographer Fabian Guerrero, queer model Jose Hernandez, beauty influencer Jennifer Ruiz, and brand designers Paisa Boys. Above is a photo shoot by Guerrero with Hernandez and Ruiz. Ruiz, by the way, is a very successful Latina beauty influencer with the handle Jenny69. So for another project that I am working, I recently read the work of Marisol Sweeney Romero analyzing Jenny69's expressions of Latinidad and Latina beauty. If you haven't seen Jenny69, it's not only incredibly entertaining, but her conversations about beauty and about Latina beauty and our perceptions and stereotypes are really interesting. So I encourage you to go and take a look. And I will own that I try to, maybe not very discreetly, insert the names here of a few people who belong to an expanding number of scholars doing research on Latin American and Latinx fashion outside the constraints of fashion design. So there are many, many more writing and researching Latin American and Latinx fashion. Let's talk a little bit about the work of Victor Barragan that you also analyzed.
Yeah, art and fashion are combined in the non-binary designs of Victor Barragan. His inspiration comes from his adolescence as a working-class gay boy in Mexico City during the 1990s. As we can see in these 3 pictures, Barragan mixes men's, women's, and unisex clothing with a strong sexual charge. Barragan's fluid sexuality breaks genders and stereotypes. He expresses new and diverse identities inspired by his gay and trans friends of various ethnicities and body types on which he tastes his designs.
So, and then now let's talk about Mateo Velázquez a little bit.
Similarly, the Colombian-born designer Mateo Velázquez addresses gender issues and some multicultural elements from a sustainable approach. Velázquez seeks to empower people through diversity in fashion to achieve tolerance and equality. The Leather Boys collection, a picture from this collection is on the right, was inspired by 1970s queer communities which identified with motorbike masculinity. The garments were made from second-hand leather clothing cut in contemporary patterns, so the recycled leather in these collections operates symbolically as a recovery of a masculinity that moves away from toxicity.
So, of course, it was very difficult for us to decide what designers we would talk to you about, but I do want to mention that explorations on gender fluidity are widespread in Latin American fashion design. Above, over there, is the work of Héctor Omar. He's a Puerto Rican designer, and this piece is called Harness Dress, and it was created as part of the celebration of 500 years of San Juan, Puerto Rico's capital. Héctor Omar was inspired by the interior of the ballroom in the San Juan Casino, which was built in 1917, so a little Art Deco. But he uses the idea of ballroom as a play on words to make queer spaces visible and indicate that we, queer people, have always been around and exercising agency by using gender nonconformist fashion. The other image is from my country, Costa Rica, which it's a brand called Amo y Señor, or Lord and Master, I guess. And they also design non-binary pieces. This one was tagged on Instagram as hashtag menswear, hashtag womenswear. So I think that by looking at fashion design in places like Costa Rica and Puerto Rico, we can expand our horizons. With the rich cultural hybridity of Latin America that we've learned about today, and particularly the Caribbean, this presents a wealth of possibilities for the exploration of gender in fashion. And I really want to insist on this, that the Caribbean, of course, really needs to occupy a larger space within dialogues of Latinx fashion. You have done work on Raul Lopez of Luar, so let's take a look at another Caribbean designer.
So the Dominican-born designer Raul Lopez considers the gender binarism irrelevant. The designer created the genderless brand Luar, his first name backwards, in 2017. In his collections, Lopez embraces his Latin origin from a feminine perspective, influenced by his queer childhood in Brooklyn. Lopez have made dresses from men's jackets, as we see in the photo on the right, and skirts from khaki pants. The contrast between the geometry of the pleats and the fluidity of the draped fabric, as we can see in the picture on the left, represents the masculine and feminine in hybrid garments, seeks to put an end to patriarchy.
So since we're coming to the end and both of us have final words, so you can tell us a little bit about how this all connects, of course, to your categories that you introduced at the beginning.
So finally, I would like to end by saying that several of the designers that I mentioned in this presentation agree that non-binary fashion seeks to overcome gender categories and favors individuality. Unisex fashion and drag elements are present in their collections. However, genderfuck ideas resonate with greater force. These ideas have been reinterpreted from their singular cultural context, and to varying degrees, this differentiates their collections from others emanating from Europe or the United States. On the other hand, unlike the Latin designers who preceded them, like Oscar de la Renta or Carolina Herrera, we are seeing an ensemble by Carolina Herrera on the left. These young creators speak openly about issues of gender, social class, ethnicity, etc., as we can see in the ensemble by Chavarria featured on the right. Ultimately, most of the designers have selected Latinx and Latin American models to give visibility to body types that have been usually underrepresented in fashion history, and most importantly, they mentioned machismo as the starting point for their reflections on gender.
And I told Alexis, I wanted to, since my emphasis is on men's fashion, I wanted to, as I mentioned before, take a few minutes to question essentializing racist stereotypes of Latin American and Latinx people, particularly the stereotype of machismo. In the early 20th century, we had white anthropologists that came to the region and, while doing some alleged objective field research, continued the colonialist effort of presenting white men as superior. Machismo, as a stereotype assigned exclusively to Latin American men, is a contested white supremacist concept that assigns a normative referent to men's lives in the region. While there is no evidence that Latinx men engage in sexism or expressions of male dominance more than any other group, including, or perhaps particularly, white men. I'm not saying that there are no men who exhibit some or all the characteristics associated to machismo in the region, but that it is important to deconstruct Latino masculinities as complex, multifaceted, and layered by variables such as class, ethnicity, race, occupation, etc. So since the concept of machismo seems a central departure point for conversations on gender and fashion in the area, I decided to illustrate for our last slide with these few images of fashion design work that includes Ricardo Seco, Rick Owens, a few others, and Latin American men that highlight a range of male identities and masculinities in fashion in Latin American and Latinx communities. I think that we're really just getting started on conversations of gender in Latin American and Latinx fashion. Thank you. Thanks, Harold.